Are most authority men?
A lot of them are, but some are
So it
women.
would be to men.
Nope, it would be to authority. But men aren't a class. Men aren't a class.
But most authorities are men, and they are
getting a
submitting to
definition
that.
out of your fucking mouth.
So
what's the argument for feminism?
What's Agrippa's trilemma?
What's the argument for feminism?
What's Agrippa's trilemma?
What's the argument for feminism?
it's called
so
debate.
I can do that too. I'm ranting. It's not semantics because I'm just granting your definition. That's fine. Make your own. Not semantic debating because I'm not disagreeing with you on feminism. So again,
you debate positions.
I know,
like
being
when you
mean to
debated Jim Bob, and you tell people
I'm
to
literally
define your
begging you
position.
to
This is
just
how
give
silly
me.
you are.
No, but evidences are arguments.
No, they're not.
Yes, they are.
No,
Yes, they are.
That's not my system. It doesn't work.
Listen.
You're walking it back because you got repeated arguments.
No, listen.
From there. Yes, you do. If you have rejected my definition, you now have to supply one. Do you want to supply a definition? The problem with this conversation. Oh my God! You're so
Evidence is not an argument. It backfires the civil rights movement. You idiot.
That doesn't mean that it's not civil rights, Jay.
Prattle or chatter? I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Holy fuck shit. This is one of the most bad shit, fucking insane debates I've ever witnessed. I was not prepared for how far this went, and now I'm disturbed. In this video, Jay Dyer debates Fabian Liberty about libertarianism, and, well, they never really get to libertarianism. This is because they were too busy debating existence. Let's take a look at Dyer's absolute stupidity.
Yeah, one ought follow the NAP.
Well, so we would start with existence exists, and we would move into formal law.
Existence exists. What is that supposed to mean?
It's an unavoidable axiom, right? So one cannot argue.
I mean, it's a self-referencing, basically, version of the identity principle.
Dyer asks what existence exists means. Now, I'm not entirely sure how familiar the philosophical or debate community is with logical axioms, especially the core axioms.
I know how that works.
But this one, this is like the biggest of them all. And as we're about to find out, axioms matter a lot. They exist to shut sophists the hell up, people like Jay Dyer. An axiom, specifically a logical axiom, is a foundational starting point for reasoning. It's not proven in the usual way. You don't argue for an axiom. It's assumed. Not arbitrarily, but because it has to be true for reasoning to even happen. Axioms are like the rules of a game, except they come before the game even begins. If you want to debate, you've already agreed that the game is possible. But for that game to function, some basic conditions have to be met. The existence of the players, a shared language, the principle of consistency. And that's where the first axiom comes in. Existence exists. All that means is something is. It doesn't claim what exists, it just affirms that something does. This is reality's most fundamental axiom. And here's the key point. You don't have to like that existence exists. Hell, you don't even have to accept it. But if you do reject it, you're out of the game. You're not debating anymore. You're just barking. That's the thing about axioms. They are indispensable to reason. Denying existence is a performative contradiction. You're using existence to deny existence. You need thought, action, something to make that denial. And those are all part of existence. This is what Dyer doesn't seem to grasp. Axioms come before argumentation. Before you can say anything, before you can even disagree, you've already assumed certain things to be true. Existence, consciousness, identity, non-contradiction, causality. These aren't optional settings. They are the preconditions for intelligibility. Without them, you don't get definitions. You don't get assertions. You don't get disagreement, proof, or meaning. You get static. You get nonsense. And yet, Dyer opens his mouth.
But what does that mean? Existence exists.
That means that existence exists, right? It is self-referencing in that situation, but one cannot argue against the concept of existence.
Actually, you can because you can actually pretty easily because existence is.
Well, yeah, I could say cats have wings.
No, existence. No. I'm making a different point. That existence is a very contested, ambiguous term in the history of philosophy. It's a metaphysical claim. So, have you justified any metaphysics yet?
Scott says, rightly, that one cannot argue against existence exists. And Dyer immediately follows up with, actually, you can? Dyer says, existence is a very contested and ambiguous term in the history of philosophy. It's a metaphysical claim. So have you justified any metaphysics yet? Yes, Jay. Philosophers have debated the nature of existence, but not whether something exists. That's not even the same conversation. Existence exists isn't a deep dive into ontological categories. Existence is the floor. It's the foundation, the non-negotiable starting point. It simply means something is. The fact that existence has been analyzed doesn't mean it's up for denial. Existence being complex does not equal existence being optional. And I guarantee you, no competent philosopher is out here trying to disprove existence. That's not even edgy, it's just incoherent. But most importantly, look at what Dyer does. He makes a claim that you can argue against existence, and then immediately shifts the burden of proof by tossing out some unrelated metaphysics bait. It's the most flagrant, greasy dodge I've ever seen in a debate. He knows he can't defend the point, so he's trying to reroute the entire discussion into another rabbit hole. It's not clever, it's not deep, it's just dishonest.
I would start where we're starting with existence, right? Existence justifies itself by negation.
Existence justifies itself. What is your proof for the proposition existence justifies itself?
It is, you cannot make any form of logical argument about anything without justifying it, without existing. Like, it's impossible to make a claim.
That's not even actually true. I mean, Boolean approaches to logic have made it deontological, so you can actually make logical arguments without ontological claims. So that's not even true. You're making an argument. The moment that you make an argument, you justify your existence. No, that's not even true. That's not a justification, and that's a fallacious move. So it doesn't prove.
Can you argue against existence?
It doesn't prove the metaphysical notion or the linguistic symbols that you use for the word existence are correct. In other words, it assumes all kinds of things like language, predication.
Scott says existence justifies itself. You cannot make any form of logical argument without existing. And Dyer responds, that's not actually even true. Boolean approaches to logic have made it deontological, so you can actually make logical arguments without ontological claims. What? Scott is 100% right. Existence does justify itself. Why? Because it's indispensable for reason. You literally can't argue without assuming existence. You, the person, the argument itself, the words coming out of your mouth, even the concepts those words represent, all of it presupposes existence. You can't deny existence without using it. You can't question it without standing on it. Even logic presupposes existence because logic is something, and something has to exist to be used. Now, as for Dyer's response, I don't even know what the hell he's talking about. Boolean logic is a symbolic system that manipulates variables using operators like and, or, and not. It's a tool. It doesn't float in some metaphysical void untethered from reality. And deontology? Why is he name dropping deontology in a logic discussion? Deontology is an ethical framework. It's got jack shit to do with formal logic. Even Boolean logic, just like any other formal system, requires existence. The variables exist. The rules exist. The person using them exists. You don't escape existence by throwing a logic table at it. If nothing exists, there is no logic, no argument, no Jay Dyer trying to embarrass himself on the internet.
Language and predication. Right. So if you'd had a philosophy language class, you would know that words like existence presuppose metaphysical structures like universals, like predication, like grammar, and none of those things have been demonstrated yet.
Oh boy, here we go again. Dyer is once again using big philosophical words to say nothing. His argument boiled down is this: you can't say something exists unless you've first proven all the tools we use to talk about it. But that is actually backwards. You can't even have those tools, grammar, logic, predication, unless something exists first. Existence is the prerequisite to all of it. It would be like saying you can't use your eyes unless you first prove the theory of light, lenses, and the human optic system. That's the proof. You start with experience, then maybe you study how it works later. In the same way, existence is not downstream of language or metaphysics. It's upstream. It is first. If you're using words, if you're questioning, objecting, philosophizing, you're already standing on existence. But Jay would rather pull a reverse cart horse reality blender just to avoid admitting something is real. What the
The concept of existence is not
the proposition existence exists. The proposition is itself relying on. Does it rely on the law of identity?
No.
Yes, it does. Existence exists is relying on the law of identity.
No, it would come after existence.
Oh my gosh.
Right? Like once.
No, to say existence exists relies on the law of identity. You're predicating identity.
Yes. Aristotelian formal logic, right? Like law of identity, law of excluded middle, and law of non-contradiction, right? Are going to be the foundation for making the argument that existence exists.
I'm calling into question the argument.
Language and all those other things. But what I'm saying is that by one attempting in any language, in any means, anytime a moral,
I know what you're saying. It's called retorsion.
Attempts to make a claim that requires existence for them, that it presupposes existence.
I am aware of that, but that still doesn't get you. I know that. I know it's called retorsion. It's called retorsion, and it doesn't get you to justification. That's the point.
Let's clear up the confusion here. The law of identity says A is A. A thing is what it is. Every entity has a specific nature or identity. Now, Dyer is both right and wrong here. The axiom existence exists does not presuppose the law of identity, and the law of identity doesn't presuppose existence either, because these are both foundational axioms. And foundational axioms aren't hierarchical. They're not stacked like Jenga blocks. You can't knock one out and expect the others to stand. They're mutually interdependent. Each one needs the other to function. You can't apply identity without something that exists. You can't say something exists without it being something. So, sorry Jay, this isn't a gotcha moment. This is your misunderstanding of how axioms work. After demanding over and over that Scott justify existence, Dyer finally gets asked to justify it himself.
All right, so how are you justifying existence? Because you clearly believe that existence.
Well, I believe in the transcendental argument for God's existence, and that's the ground for the logical categories which make it possible to predicate at all. So that's my worldview account.
Okay, so what is Dyer actually saying here? He's saying existence is grounded by logic. Logic is grounded by God. Therefore, God is the foundation of existence, logic, and meaning. This is a version of something called the Transcendental Argument for God, or TAG. Unfortunately, this is also called not answering the question. It's a dodge, a shiny example of the divine fallacy, also known as the argument from incredulity. Dyer can't justify existence on its own terms, so instead he punts the ball to God, a being who, by definition, can't be directly interrogated. That's not a justification. He's outsourcing his epistemology to a being beyond comprehension. Dyer claims that God is the precondition for logic, but never demonstrates why. He just asserts it. And then he acts like this settles the matter, like he just pulled the sword from the stone. No, Jay, you pulled the sword from your ass. Okay, let's look at Jay Dyer's big brain statement.
All beliefs, all propositions, all statements, truth statements, etc., in my view, are theory laden. And so this has been a long walk to get to the point to try to prove or demonstrate that classical foundationalism, which is the epistemology that the Enlightenment relies upon in most libertarians, is philosophically and epistemically on faulty ground.
Oh boy, Dyer has officially done it. He's denied the very foundation that he's standing on. It seems like Jay either doesn't understand foundationalism or he just hates it because he doesn't know how to work with it, which is ironic for someone who thinks he's good at philosophy. So let's define it. Foundationalism is the view that knowledge is built on a foundation. Some beliefs are justified independently without needing other beliefs to support them, and all other justified beliefs are built on top of these foundational ones. What are some examples? Existence exists. A is A. I think, therefore I am. Contradictions can't be true. Causality exists. These are axioms. They're self-evident, inescapable, and indispensable. You cannot refute them without assuming them. And here's the funny thing. If you say foundationalism is false, you're making a truth claim. But to do that, you already have to assume that logic is valid, that truth exists, that you exist to make the claim. So, denying foundationalism is like yelling, there is no ground to stand on, while standing on the ground and yelling it. Every other epistemological theory breaks itself. Coherentism doesn't honor the law of non-contradiction. Infinitism rejects causal closure. Skepticism rejects objectivity, which refutes itself. All argumentation requires foundationalism. It needs identity, non-contradiction, existence, meaning. And yet, here's Dyer flinging around philosophical words like confetti without even understanding what he's talking about.
Who can exist, right, without existing?
So you're answering a question to answer the question I asked you?
I'm trying to get you to understand
maybe
my argument
maybe everything is an ideal existence and there is no external world. I don't believe that, but I'm saying that your assumptions are not justified even within your own system. How do I know that the word existence, when it has a vast array of meanings throughout the history of philosophy, somehow necessarily means a material, physical, external world? There's nothing about the word existence that necessarily means that. And when I ask you how you know that or why we should think that, you say it just has to be that way. Well, that's a fallacy of incredulity.
Even if existence is ideal, it still exists. How does Dyer not grasp something this fundamentally simple? Sure, some philosophers believe the world is mind dependent. That's fine. But do those minds perceiving the world exist? Yes, that's the point. Whether it's material or immaterial, physical or ideal, it still is. And that's the distinction. Not what the thing is, but that it is. It honestly feels like Dyer is confusing the idea that Scott is arguing for a material world, but he's not. Scott is just saying that something exists. It doesn't have to be atoms, doesn't have to be a brick, it's just something. The point is something rather than nothing. That's it. That is the axiom. Even Dyer's favorite thinkers, Berkeley, Descartes, Plato, none of them deny that something exists. Because if nothing exists, there's no one there to deny it. Not even Jay Dyer.
So what is your good account that solves this problem in the existence?
Well, there are no self-evident positions or statements because they're embedded within a network or a web of beliefs that we all have. And thus, if my system or my view is holistic, if I'm an epistemic holist, then I have to give an account for the system as a whole and how those structures or how those preconditions are the case. So if I need the possibility predication, universals, mathematics, logic, all of these categories being the true, the good, etc., to have knowledge at all, then I need to give some account for those things, those categories that my statements are relying on. And the Transcendental Argument argues that only God is the type of being who could give a justification or account for those things.
Holy shit. Jay Dyer is a coherentist. It all makes sense now. He can say epistemic holist all he wants, but it's the same thing. He believes beliefs are only justified within a system, that you can't evaluate any one claim on its own, only how it fits in the web. But here's the funny thing. Jay lives like a foundationalist. He uses logic, he uses language, he uses identity, causality, and existence, all foundational axioms, while simultaneously denying their independence. He rejects self-evident propositions and then asserts that God grounds everything. So let's get this straight. There are no self-evident truths, but God explains all truth. And you just have to believe that. There's no argument, no proof, no coherence. He just throws out all these philosophical terms and hope nobody knows what he's saying, because he's not saying anything. So Scott finally pushes Dyer to justify his worldview. Let's take a look.
God is necessary. Where are you making that? I heard a lot of
God. I would say God is necessary.
God is necessary for these things.
God is necessary in the sense that he's the necessary justification for the transcendental categories that make knowledge possible. Only that type of a being could ground things like universals.
Basically, you can't justify logic or causation without God. But instead of showing why, Jay just defines God as the only one able to do it. That doesn't make any sense. He says it's not a God of the gaps, it's stronger, because he claims every act of predication assumes logic, which assumes transcendental categories, which assume God. That is presuppositionalism. It means you're talking, therefore God exists. Except we have a problem. Until Dyer proves that transcendental categories require God and that no other grounding is possible, it's completely circular. He just asserts that only God can explain logic. But saying you can't form a sentence without God isn't a demonstration. It's not even smart. He's just saying, because I said so. Let's be ultimately charitable to Jay Dyer and actually talk about his core argument, the Transcendental Argument for God, the TAG. The central claim of TAG is that the very possibility of things like knowledge, logic, morality, or rational thought presupposes the existence of God. It's structured something like this. If God does not exist, then logic, morality, knowledge have no justification. But we do use logic, we do use reason, we do hold moral beliefs. Therefore, God must exist, because he is the necessary precondition for those things. Dyer repeats this often, that transcendental categories like the laws of logic, the uniformity of nature, morality, minds, and language must be grounded in something. Logic isn't physical, so materialism can't explain it. Science assumes induction, but can't justify why tomorrow should resemble today. Morality needs objective standards, but relativism can't provide them. Minds can't emerge from matter. So, Dyer's move is to say only theism, specifically the Christian God, can account for these things. And therefore, when we use logic or morality, we're already presupposing God, whether we admit it or not. But here's the thing. There are serious problems with this argument, and they start at premise 1. Let's start with the word doing the most heavy lifting here. Justification. What kind of justification are we even talking about? Is it epistemic? How we know logic is valid? Is it ontological? What makes logic or morality real? Is it normative? Why should we use logic or morality? Or metaphysical necessity? Why are these things necessary for human experience? TAG advocates never clarify. They just throw out justification like it's a self-evident crisis, but they never define the problem. What they seem to mean is that logic, reason, and morality require stance-independent normative foundations, something external that validates them beyond mere utility. But here's the problem. That's not metaphysical realism. That's moral realism, a completely separate philosophical position. And moral realism is not axiomatic. It's not some default setting baked into the universe. It's a claim. And it requires its own argument. You can't just assume realism is true, then say, only God explains it. You first have to prove why these things need objective stance-independent grounding to begin with. Once you reject that hidden assumption, once you stop pretending that reason and morality require some external metaphysical permission, the whole argument collapses at premise 1. Why? Because the reason we use logic, induction, and math isn't because some divine being told us to. It's because they work. They're instrumentally useful. They help us understand the world. They let us solve problems, avoid contradictions, build computers, treat diseases, and dunk on YouTube apologists. That is the justification. Utility is the grounding. We don't need a cosmic legislator to validate our ability to reason. We need results. So, in the end, TAG doesn't prove God. It just assumes a metaphysical framework where only God is allowed to do the grounding. But if you don't buy that framework, if you don't believe that logic or morality need that kind of external moral realist style oughtness, the argument goes up in smoke before it even gets started. I'm coming back to my script after a few days, and some things have changed. I recently debated a pre-supper only to find out just how deep the view actually goes. What I've come to realize is that the whole idea behind TAG is built on a very small but very critical logical mistake they haven't noticed. The main claim in presuppositionalist circles is this: logic, morality, and intelligibility must be grounded in the Christian God, because everything, ultimately requires justification. And what could possibly justify something as foundational as logic? Only something transcendental, only God. But here's the problem. That proposition is a category error. Logic is not a conclusion. You don't put logic into a syllogism. Logic is the rules of the syllogism. It took me a little time to fully grasp that, but once it clicked, I realized something important. You don't justify logic, because logic is what makes justification possible in the first place. I said this exact same thing in my debate with the pre-supper. A lot of people think logic is some kind of perfect, 100% certain knowledge, but that's a misunderstanding. Knowledge will never be certain, but the best knowledge we have is the kind that's indispensable, and that's what logic is, an indispensable system. Just like you can't function in life without implicitly accepting existence, you also must implicitly accept identity, non-contradiction, causality, and so on. Denying those isn't just philosophical empty, it's literally paralyzing. You can't move forward. And even worse, denying them is a performative contradiction, because you can't act, you can't even speak without relying on them. Pre-supper's main gripe is that logic needs to be grounded, but this is where they're wrong. Logic is prior to grounding. We only understand epistemology, how we know anything, through logic. You don't start with God, you start with logic. And that's why tag ultimately fails. You don't presuppose God, you presuppose logic.
The only healthy society that we can have is a patriarchal society.
This debate was a trash fire. This was actually the first time I officially learned who Jay Dyer was. I'd heard his name floating around before, but none of his debate titles ever looked interesting enough to click, so I never checked him out. Holy I dodged a missile by not watching this man sooner. Until this video. And let me tell you, it might be the first time I've ever seen the YouTube comments on the Whatever podcast actually call the man out. That is insane. Considering how massive the conservative red pill audience is on this show, the fact that so many of them were openly dragging Dyer, that's wild. It just shows how badly he did. Although, of course, there were still some brain-dead comments tossing out boos toward not so erudite, which, like, I get it. She's a lefty. She makes some bad arguments. But if we're just looking at her performance in this debate, she absolutely demolished Dyer. That being said, prepare your eyes to burn, like Jay's.
So we should have more people in society?
Sure. But I don't know if this is connected to birth rate.
Well, yeah, because the more people in society would then back up what you're arguing, right? But don't we need more husbands and wives to have more people?
What is happening to his eyes?
Okay, so the net good for society is just what? More fiat money? Like what determines that?
Yep, GDP is a good thing. Do you disagree?
Yeah, I do.
You don't think
first
GDP
of all,
is
like,
good?
what if the money is a scam?
That doesn't have anything to do with GDP. Why would not having more GDP for a country not be good?
So, Dyer starts cross-examining Kyla's view of the good in society. He asks her to define her standard. Kyla answers with something pretty reasonable. When more people, specifically women, are given freedom and opportunity, you get a larger pool of innovators. This leads to higher productivity, more ideas, and yeah, potentially a greater GDP. That's a net positive for society. And Jay laughs at this. Now, to be fair, Dyer thinks that the US economy is a debt-based scam, so to him, a rising GDP is meaningless if the currency itself is eroding in value. That's a legitimate critique on its own. But I don't think Dyer is approaching this debate in good faith. Kyla brought a weak form of the argument, GDP growth, but the stronger version of what she's saying is this. She wants to increase well-being, a physically and psychologically healthier society, a freer society, a wealthier, more expressive, more fulfilled population. It's basic utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. GDP was just the economic shorthand for a broader point. But rather than engage with that, rather than trying to steelman her position, Dyer just tries to flex. He shifts the topic to monetary theory and starts mocking her for not understanding fiat currency systems and inflation mechanics. He doesn't address her argument. He just addresses her like she's dumb. And that's not honest philosophy.
We can do Agrippa's trilemma. It's just useless. I can use it at you too, right?
Well, but if I'm arguing for a moral ought on the basis of...
This is not a moral ought.
It is. You said it's a good. If you said something is good...
I said it's functional. Yeah, what word? Okay, we're doing chatter.
So
what
now
word do you want me to use when I say functional?
No. In a debate, if you're arguing for your position, then you're necessarily arguing that we ought to follow your position.
Yeah, I think I said it's a necessity and an unavoidable. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's a moral claim. It would be like realpolitik.
Well, then it's an ought, because do you think we ought to follow your arguments?
Not all oughts are moral.
At this point, Dyer wants to drill down into Kyla's worldview. Specifically, he wants her to define the good. Based on what we've seen so far, I think I get his strategy. He wants to reduce her position to absurdity, bring the debate to metaphysics where he can drop a bunch of philosophical lingo and dominate the terrain. Kyla, meanwhile, is more grounded in data, social theory, and economics. So if he can bait her into a philosophical boxing match, he thinks he can win by default. The goal is to collapse her worldview into moral relativism. Similar to what Andrew Wilson does. Then he can go, gotcha, you can't justify your values. You don't have objective morality. Checkmate. Kyla tries to make a clear distinction. She tells him that her personal view of the good is grounded in divine command theory, which is her belief system. But what she's defending in the debate is the functional utility of a society. In the case of feminism, she's pointing out that one benefit is an increased GDP, or, to be put in stronger terms, the increased wealth and opportunity for society at large. So while Dyer tries to hit her with the "you have no metaphysical foundation," she's over here saying, yeah dude, I do. I'm just not debating that right now. I'm talking about practical outcomes. But instead of engaging that distinction, Dyer just keeps hitting her worldview from an angle she's not even arguing from. He's not interested in clarifying. He's interested in winning.
Yeah, I think I said it's a necessity and an unavoidable. That doesn't mean it doesn't mean it's a moral claim. It would be like realpolitik.
Well, then it's an ought, because do you think we ought to follow your arguments?
Not all oughts are moral.
Ought we follow your arguments?
As in, like, should you do what I prescribe for society?
Ought we follow the true arguments versus the false arguments?
Sure.
Okay. Then you're using an ought right now to argue for your position.
Sure, but this isn't a moral claim.
You just argue that we ought to follow your position. That's
it's still not a moral claim.
It is.
It's not.
Oughts are morals if you're extending them to everybody in the theoretical realm of listening to the debate.
Do you think that it's moral or not moral to have GDP? Do you think GDP is moral?
Dyer says that if you're arguing for your position in a debate, you're arguing that people ought to follow your position. Kyla agrees, but adds that this doesn't necessarily make it a moral claim. She says not all oughts are moral. Let's unpack this mess. First off, all oughts are normative. That's what ought means. And depending on how you define moral, all oughts can be moral too. But this is the key. What do they mean by moral? It sounds like Kyla is separating morality from consequentialism, or deontology from consequentialism. When she says moral, she really means deontological, as in the good in some intrinsic principled way. So she's compartmentalizing what is good for the health of the nation versus what is morally right in an absolute or intrinsic sense. But Dyer is using the good in a much broader sense. His definition wraps up consequentialism and deontology into one unified moral standard, which, spoiler alert, ends in Christian ethics. His criticism would be something like, consequentialism is morally bankrupt. It's relativism. It lacks justification. Therefore, it cannot be good. And then he laughs like a Bond villain.
I'm not saying it's a sick burn.
Now, to be fair, Dyer is correct that all human action is normative, in the sense that people act purposefully, and that purpose is guided by some value, goal, or principle. So technically, they're both right, using their own definitions, which is why they're talking past each other and nothing is getting resolved.
I've said.
Okay, so, and what is the good?
Jay, I don't know how to explain to you over and over that this is not a moral claim. It's realpolitik.
You're saying that?
It's pragmatism.
You're saying that, but ought we follow your argument in pragmatism here?
If you want a flourishing society by and large.
So we ought, logically.
Sure, but
ought we logically?
It's not a moral claim.
It's not.
Is GDP a moral claim?
It can be, depending upon
How?
the system.
Because adding the word logically onto ought we suddenly makes it so much more profound. This guy is such a dork.
Not everything in regard to warfare or history of civilizations is necessarily right or wrong. It's a question of what might be the best or the worst. So there can be scales. It's not
Would you
all
say
either
that
or.
there are some things that aren't moral necessarily? Some of them are just pragmatic, and then there's some things that are moral?
Everything could potentially be moral, but some things are pragmatic, sure.
Okay. That's basically what I've been saying.
Come on, man. After all that buildup, all the grinning, all the smugness.
There's our smudgeness.
You just switch positions? Dyer has been mocking Kyla this whole time because she's using a consequentialist lens. And now he agrees with her? He had one job, just one. Tell her that all human action is normative, that everything is done in pursuit of the good, i.e. Christian ethics. But the moment Kyla presses him on pragmatic versus moral action, he caves. By conceding that some things are just pragmatic, he's implicitly validating her worldview, possibly a messy blend of threshold deontology or rule utilitarianism. And that's completely incompatible with his position of moral absolutism. He just undermined his own argument.
Again, this word that we're basically doing chatter around, where you're assigning a label to it, and I haven't agreed to it.
I'm trying to figure out your position on the good.
My position on the good is it's holistic. There are things that are good because it's functional, and there are things that it's good because it's moral, right?
Is the debate today, feminism, about the good of the moral for society?
It's about, I guess, I would like to make the case for both.
The answer, okay. So
Functional
then that
moral.
means that everything you've been saying for the last hour is wrong.
No, because I'm making a case for the functional element too.
But the fact that you're making the case for the functional element too doesn't matter if you're also talking about the moral.
You can make both arguments, and I would like to engage in the first one.
Kyla says feminism is good for society from a functional perspective. She argues that it increases the innovator pool and that it's the right thing to do. She says it's right because, in general, we should treat people well, and that limiting people's opportunities by force is harmful. Here's the issue. She's mixing functionality with morality. She's trying to argue both that feminism leads to a better societal outcome, which is consequentialism, and that it's just the right thing to do, which is deontology. This is a weak metaethical position. It's not totally incoherent, but it's messy. And that's exactly why Dyer wants to yank her into metaphysics. That's his arena. If Kyla had stuck purely to utility, she could have avoided the ethical minefield and easily stomped Dyer. But instead, she mixes frameworks and it dilutes her position. That said, yes, her metaethics are shaky, but let's not forget, Jay Dyer still sucks.
The issue, rather than you just being bad faith for no reason,
No,
is
this
that
is good. You don't know you didn't even know what an internal critique is. So I'm not being bad faith. I've been debating for 25 years.
it's
not bad faith.
it's completely fine to know what terms are, right?
Sure, but in terms of debate, that's like 101, knowing what an internal critique is.
I understand what like consistency checks are. I just didn't use the language internal critique, right? So if we want to go back an hour, you agreed to this idea of chatter, right? How we want to define concepts, agree to them so that we can talk about
Women
ideas.
prattle or chatter? I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Dyer smugly claims that Kyla doesn't even know what an internal critique is. First of all, that's an ad hominem, at least in the way he presents it. It doesn't matter if she knew the name. She clearly understands the concept. And this right here is what makes Dyer so irritating. Yes, he's read a lot. Yes, he's memorized a bunch of terms, arguments, and philosopher names. But he's not doing anything substantive with them. Instead, he's playing philosophical word games. He's trying to run circles around opponents by referencing things they haven't heard of without building a coherent argument. That's not smart. That's just sophistry. Knowing the terms, but using them to confuse, misdirect, or humiliate your opponent is the exact opposite of what Socrates would have done. Dyer is not helping or teaching. He's posturing.
To prove the history of the movement and what it teaches. Yes, I just gave you the example.
Okay.
I've been debating for 25 years. I know what the appeal to authority is. That's one right there.
Okay, so
see,
when
that's the appeal to authority fallacy.
When you appeal to irrelevant people that sound authoritative
it's not
but aren't relevant, the history of feminism isn't relevant to you giving me a definition of feminism that I can operate
Is it a historical movement?
Can you give me
Is it a historical movement?
Okay, here Jay Dyer's citing an appeal to authority by literally appealing to authority. This is wild because just earlier, he unironically appealed to his own authority, as if being familiar with Aquinas and Orthodox theology automatically makes him immune to critique. But here he is again, stacking appeals like they're Pokemon cards.
Yeah. Well, you're a big boy, so this should be really easy for you to find feminism. Go ahead.
Feminism is a historical movement that's concerned with the rights of women, including egalitarianism, the idea that women and men are equal. If we go back to Wollstonecraft, if we go back to the suffrage movement, if we go back to the notion of women not being married at certain ages as children. So the first wave wanted not just suffragism
but they also wanted to not have child brides and that kind of stuff.
I'm really proud of you. You got
but they
two
also,
things.
listen,
One more.
I'm not, shut up.
We're super
Shut
close.
up and let me finish.
I'm
not
close.
done.
Yeah, I believe
I'm not
you.
done. They also wanted better work hours. They wanted women to have inheritance rights. They wanted women to be able to get jobs and they wanted women in the workforce and to be in positions that they didn't have. So they wanted certain social rights that women, like voting, right, suffrage, right? Those are all first wave.
Yeah.
Okay.
In this segment, Kyla asks for a definition of feminism, which is a simple task. What does Dyer do in response? He detours into the entire history of feminism. Now, yes, to be fair, history does matter when crafting a deeper understanding of any term, but history is not the same thing as a definition. If I ask you to define slavery and you respond by walking me through the rise and fall of every civilization that practiced it without ever just saying slavery is the ownership and forced labor of another person, you're dodging. You're f***ing dodging. This is what Dyer's doing. He's not confused. He knows exactly what Kyla is asking for, but he's stalling. He refuses to give her a basic working definition because he wants to frame the term on his own arena. He refuses to give her a basic working definition because that would just make it too easy for her. Kyla is trying to move the discussion forward, and Dyer is stalling.
Right. This is your definition of feminism? Okay, I'm writing it down.
Are you serious?
I'm so dumb.
You asked for the history of it.
I didn't ask you for the history. I asked you for a definition.
You said that it's historical.
Okay,
and I'm giving you the movements.
I'm not asking for the history. I'm asking you.
You said it is historical, so I have to go back to the people.
No,
you're so dumb that you can't conceive of a position apart from the people who came up with the position.
I'll do so. Israel. I can define Israel without going through the entire history of Israel. Feminism, while it does have...
Actually,
yes, of course you can.
No, this is so silly because you admitted it's a historical movement. Therefore, it can't be divorced from the people in history.
I'm not asking
you to think it came out of the sky? Did it come into people's minds out of the sky or from the people?
You're doing a false dichotomy again.
Kyla shows correctly that you can define a word without giving a 10-minute TED Talk on its etymology. Dyer disagrees, of course, because if you define a term cleanly, he can't warp it into something he can easily tear down. So he stalls.
About semantics.
I'm not quibbling. I'm literally not quibbling. I am writing down your words.
Oh, so if you're writing it down.
I'm granting, it's not semantics because I'm just granting your definition.
I thought it was semantics. No, it's not.
It's not semantic debating because I'm not disagreeing with you on your definition. I'm literally begging you to just give me one. I'm begging you at this point because you don't like mine. So let's give yours.
I don't care what your definition is because all I have to do is critique your position internally and points out that it's so ambiguous.
You do have to care about my definition if you're going to do an internal critique. That's the fundamental of a fucking internal critique is that
now you do know about so you just learned about an internal critique about 10 minutes ago and now you're going to lecture me on it.
You're a really good teacher, Jay. What can I say? So
the debate's over.
You do care about
she admitted she's learning.
You do care about feminism and my definition of it because you need it for the internal critique, which you've already acknowledged.
I don't care about it because
but now you've rejected my definition of feminism. So again, I know being mean to women is your fallback if you have nothing else to do.
Ad hominem now, so there we go.
It's not an ad hominem. I didn't say that you're
mean to you.
No, I didn't say you're wrong because you're being an asshole. I just said you're an asshole.
Now you're getting your feelings.
That's not an ad hominem.
And now the dictionary debate. Jay tries to say that referencing a dictionary is an appeal to authority. It's not. An appeal to authority happens when someone blindly accepts a claim just because some important person said it, without evidence. A dictionary isn't an authority in that sense. It's a reference. It reflects consensus usage, not some divine law. Contrary to Dyer's rigid view, language is not objective or absolute. It is a social tool, constructed inductively so that we can share thoughts, ideas, and meaning. Dictionaries document language. They do not decree it.
No, it's called a debate.
I can do that too. If you want me to just mock you every time you stutter, we can have a super fun conversation.
It's just how debates work. I'm sorry.
Mocking people when they stutter is not...
Rhetoric is part of debate. Yes,
this is not rhetoric. This is just you being
Have you ever watched an Oxford Union debate? They make fun of each other.
I'm fine with you making fun of each other.
That's what I've been doing.
Okay. Would you like to have a productive conversation too, or do you want to just? We can circle the drain.
I'm having a great time.
That's fine.
This is why I have no respect for Jay Dyer, and why I would seriously grapple with the thought of ever talking with him. Because for Jay-rae, the Because for Jay, truth doesn't matter. What matters is performance. What matters is mockery, rhetoric, scorekeeping, getting dunks in front of a crowd of cheering red pill boys who already think he's brilliant for saying Kant with confidence. He's treating this like a gladiatorial arena. He's doing it for YouTube views, and that completely misses the point. The reason philosophy is supposed to matter, the reason it's so awesome is because it seeks truth. It sharpens the mind. It helps us explore the world, question assumptions, and maybe become better people. But Jay doesn't use philosophy that way. He uses it as a weapon, a stage prop, a way to mock, demean,
you moron,
and dominate.
We're trying
not to help, but to perform. Not to learn, but to win. And that's exactly why debates like this feel like trash fires instead of actual discussions.
Tell me what Agrippa's trilemma is.
I'm not answering any of your objections or questions until you give an argument for feminism.
Just so you're aware, he just
what is the argument for feminism other than GDP and God liberal?
Agrippa's trilemma is really important to understand. Anytime a person tries to hit you with this like circular, like normative, like no argument you make makes any sense.
You're not even doing
what you have to hit them back with is essentially Agrippa's trilemma, which is that
she's just repeating what she heard Destiny say. She's just repeating some bullshit from Destiny.
I don't think I've ever heard him ever talk about
what's the argument for feminism other than GDP and God liberal?
And so when you're dealing with people who just like constantly fall back on circular reasoning and like trying to hit you with like, none of this stuff makes any sense. Agrippa's trilemma basically points out that every single argument fundamentally at like the foundational level never truly makes sense. There's some level of like ambiguous
who's up here?
Lack of
who
justification.
Are you talking to up here?
I'm thinking.
Spurging out?
Good one.
There's nobody up there.
Good one.
I'm right here.
Why are you wearing a silly shirt? How come you have to close your eyes? Why do you have floaters in your eyes? Look how stupid that. Yeah, it's stupid.
Kyla takes a moment to explain Agrippa's trilemma, and honestly, it's a fair and important critique. The trilemma says that no belief can be justified in a purely deductive, complete, and non-circular way. Any attempt to justify a belief system must fall into one of three dead ends. Infinite regress. Justifying a belief requires another justification, which requires another, and so on in an endless chain. The problem? You never land. There's no stopping point. There's no firm ground. This is a widely discussed issue in philosophy because it undermines the possibility of arriving at a final conclusion. In the end, there is no justification. It just keeps on going. Circular reasoning. Justifying a belief by assuming it in the premise. This is often linked to coherentism, an epistemological theory that says beliefs are justified by how well they fit into the entire belief system. But that just means that the system is spinning in a circle, internally consistent but ungrounded. Coherentism is the same thing as circular reasoning, it's just a longer chain. Finally, dogmatism, accepting a belief without justification. No further reasoning, just this is true because it has to be. This is often thrown at foundationalism, which supposedly accepts axioms without proof. But here's where Agrippa misses the mark. Yes, technically he's right. Axioms are not 100% provable in the strict deductive sense. But that's not what foundational axioms are meant to even do. Their power doesn't come from being provable. Their power comes from being indispensable. We accept axioms not because we're absolutely certain they're true, but because we literally can't function without them. Denying them doesn't make you deep. It makes you unintelligible. Denying them collapses the possibility of inquiry itself. It's like this. We're all born into a game. We don't know all the rules, but we're clearly playing something. And in order to participate, to make decisions, reason, ask questions, take actions, we implicitly accept some fundamental tools. That we exist, that contradictions don't hold, that causes precede effects. Even if we don't know the full scope of reality, we use these tools because they work. They are performatively verified by the very fact that we're using them. You act as if you exist. You act as if contradictions aren't true. You act as if things cause other things. Agrippa treats all beliefs like propositions that must be justified, similar to presuppositionalists. But axioms aren't beliefs. They are the rules of the game. They're not inside the game board. They are the board. And when we engage in debate and thought in life, we are already playing. We are already presupposing these axioms. Even if we deny them, we're using them. Agrippa's point is that we don't have certainty, and that's totally fine. That's fair. But what he can't escape is indispensability. Axioms are not certain, but they are necessary. That is the move foundationalism makes, and that's why it wins. Foundationalism doesn't fall into infinite regress. It doesn't spin in circles like coherentism. It identifies the basic rules assumes them as preconditions, and proceeds from there. Performatively consistent all the way down. All other epistemological systems that try to avoid foundationalism end up doing so by not presupposing the logical axioms, which makes them contradictory at the root. And that's why foundationalism isn't just a good theory, it's the only one that lets you think without sawing off the branch you're sitting on.
I don't accept the infinite regress at all.
Oh, wow. How do you do that?
How do I do that?
Yeah.
I don't have that philosophical system.
Yeah, but how do you solve it?
It's not a problem.
It's not a philosophical system. Infinite regress is not a philosophical system. It's a foundational issue to every single philosophical system.
I'm aware of that. I'm a presuppositionalist. I know how that works.
Right. So there's always a why behind your presuppositions, right?
What does that have to do with this?
That's what infinite regress is. Yeah, there's a why behind every
I know what infinite regress is. So you're not going to convince anyone in the audience that you're trumping me here.
Jay Dyer says he doesn't accept infinite regress. He claims that his worldview doesn't fall into that trap because he doesn't have the philosophical system. But what system does he have? Based on what he said throughout the debate, he seems to be operating under coherentism, but with a twist. God is arbitrarily placed in the center of the web. He talks like a coherentist, but claims to have a foundational anchor, which is ironic because the foundation he picks is a theological assertion, not a logical necessity. But fine, let's grant him that much. He's technically right that his system doesn't rely on infinite regress because it's worse. His system falls into something stupider, a self-reinforcing circle. A is justified by B, B is justified by C, C is justified by D, and D goes back to A. Many of you know this as circular reasoning, but I like to call it webular reasoning because it looks sophisticated until you realize that it's a logical hamster wheel. It's fallacious. It's invalid. It's the epistemological equivalent of arguing, I'm right because my system says I'm right. Dispensability. The fatal flaw in Dyer's worldview, and of coherentism more broadly, is that it refuses to accept the indispensability of axioms. But axioms aren't optional. They're not just one epistemic tool among many. They are the preconditions. You can't debate without existence. You can't argue without identity. You can't reason without non-contradiction. Foundationalism acknowledges this. It says these axioms are not proven, but they are necessary. Denying them destroys the game. Dyer's worldview denies them, and yet he uses them. That is a performative contradiction. He mocks the foundation he relies on. He denies the axioms while using them.
Do you want to supply a definition?
Let's be real for a second. If you watched this debate and thought, why is Jay Dyer acting like such a smug jackass? You're not alone. Even people who normally agree with him were calling it out. It's not just the condescending tone, it's the way he debates. And at this point, we need to break it down. So let's look at this in two parts. How he debates and what he actually argues. Jay doesn't argue to explore ideas. He argues to win. And I mean that in the most performative, watch me dunk on this person kind of way. Watch how he talks. He doesn't engage with Kyla's points. He laughs at them. He mocks her. He sarcastically repeats what she says like a 14-year-old in a classroom.
The reason that we went into the history and why I said I don't care about the history is I was asking for a functional definition so we could move past that part of the conversation. I always acknowledge that history was part of the feminist movement and it's tied to it.
I reject that there is a definition divorced from history.
I've never said that there's a definition divorced from history. I said I don't need the history.
Because you asked
I said I don't need the history lesson. I don't need the history lesson.
You asked me for that.
You got to let me finish, Jay.
You asked me because you're lying. You asked me for that divorce. You said divorce from history. What is your definition? That's what you said.
Yeah, I didn't want the history
Thank you.
lesson.
So you just contradicted yourself.
No, I didn't contradict myself,
You're
Jay.
a machine of contradiction.
You're desperate. You're so desperate. You're like, God, how do I get this win? I asked for you to stop giving me all of the history and just give me a definition so we can move the fuck on.
I don't accept that there is a definition divorced from history, and you just admitted that you goofus.
You don't have the brain capacity to define something without a 5-minute monologue about the history.
You just admitted you can't do that.
Define Israel. Are you going to go back 3,000 years to define it?
Yes, because it's an ancient historical nation. Yes,
so you can't define Israel without giving me a 10-minute monologue.
Kyla asks for a simple, functional definition so that they can move forward in the conversation. But instead of giving her that definition, Dyer pivots into a whole lecture about the history of the term. Why? Who knows? It's weird. It's also bad faith. Kyla literally grants that words have historical context. That's not the debate. She's just trying to get a working definition on the table so that they can argue about the actual ideas. But Dyer refuses to give her one. He keeps insisting that her definitions are reductive, but he never never explains why that's a problem. Here's the thing. Definitions are by nature reductive. That's kind of the point. A definition is a compressed version of a broader concept. It's a linguistic shortcut. It's not supposed to carry the full weight of historical, political, and philosophical nuance. If we had to unpack the entire history of every term before using it, we'd never finish a sentence. If I say feminism is the movement for equal rights for women, that's a clean, functional definition. Is it missing centuries of complexity? Of course, but that's what definitions do. They reduce. They're tools for communication. They're not dissertations. So when Dyer refuses to give a definition and drags the conversation into a historical monologue, it doesn't feel helpful. It feels like he's stalling. And secondly, what he argues. His actual worldview is weak. Strip away the confidence in the orthodox aesthetics and what's left? Nothing. He says God is the only thing that can justify logic. But why? Well, because he's God. That's it. That's the whole argument. He's rejecting foundationalism, but he uses foundational axioms constantly. He mocks existence exists while using logic, identity, and causality in every sentence. Again, a performative contradiction. You can't deny the tools of logic while using them. And when he finally lands on his actual structure, it's just coherentism. Everything is justified in a web of beliefs, and God is at the center. Because Dyer says so. It's circular. It explains nothing. It just sounds deep. This is all kind of a shame. Jay Dyer seems like a smart dude. He's clearly well-read, knows his history, and he's obviously spent a lot of time studying philosophy. But instead of being epistemically humble, open to understanding other people's ideas and engaging with them honestly, he seems more interested in dominating the conversation with big words and rhetoric. A lot of you out there have probably run into a Philbro before. The kind of guy who just drops convoluted sentences that barely even register as English, just to confuse the room and make his opponent feel dumb. Jay Dyer slips into that mode more often than not. It's bad faith. That's not what truth seekers do. That's what someone ruled by pride does. And what does pride lead to? People stop respecting you. People tune you out. Jay Dyer could be a strong debater. He definitely has the tools, but he gives into the pleasure of intellectual dominance, the thrill of talking over people, the power that comes from using words only he understands. And honestly, that's one of philosophy's oldest traps. This illusion of superiority. It's easy to fall into. I get it, but it has consequences because, as we all know, pride comes before the fall. So yeah, Jay Dyer debates in bad faith. He doesn't want to explore truth. He wants to dominate a conversation. He mocks, misdirects, and hides behind jargon. And his actual arguments collapse into assertion and circularity. What a fool.
There are no tampons.
There's no such thing as tampons.
No.
Okay, great. If the tampons...
There's no such thing.
Did they exist in Rome?
No.
So tampons are not real.
Correct.